In the twilight of May 1945, while the last flames of World War II were still burning in the ruins of Berlin, a secret meeting in the cabinets of British power would forever shape the destiny of humanity. Winston Churchill, the architect of the Allied victory against Nazism, contemplated a reality that few dared to admit. The war had ended, but peace was far from won. In the oak-panelled rooms of 10 Downing Street, the British Prime Minister elaborated a plan that would challenge not only the emerging world order, but the very nature of the alliance that had defeated Hitler. It was May 22, 1945, and Churchill was about to authorize one of the most audacious and controversial military projects in modern history, a preemptive strike against Britain's most powerful ally, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. Central Europe was breathing the heavy air of victory and destruction. Millions of Soviet soldiers occupied territories stretching from the frozen plains of East Prussia to the golden hills of Austria. The Red Army, tempered in 4 years of brutal warfare against the German war machine, had emerged as the most formidable terrestrial military force on the planet. Stalin, the man of steel who had transformed the Soviet Union from an agrarian nation into an industrial superpower, now dictated the terms of the new European order. His troops were not mere liberators. They were conquerors carrying an ideology that threatened to redefine the continent forever. Churchill watched this advance with growing alarm, understanding that the freedom he had fought for during 6 long years of war might be replaced by an even more comprehensive and lasting tyranny. The tensions between the former allies were not just philosophical or ideological, they were profoundly practical and territorial. Stalin had promised free and democratic elections in Poland during the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, but the intelligence reports reaching London told a completely different story. The Polish government in exile, which had fought alongside the British since 1939, was being systematically eliminated and replaced by communist puppets loyal to Moscow. Poland, for which Great Britain had originally declared war on Germany, was being handed over to another totalitarian dictator. This betrayal of democratic principles represented not only a breach of diplomatic promises, but a sinister harbinger of what Stalin planned for the rest of Eastern Europe. Churchill understood that every day of hesitation strengthened the Soviet position and irreversibly weakened the Western capacity to resist communist expansion. The British Prime Minister was not alone in his concerns. Confidential intelligence reports described a consistent pattern of Soviet behavior in all liberated territories. In Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, the same methods were applied: physical or political elimination of democratic leaders, installation of communist puppet governments, and gradual integration of these territories into the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin was not just consolidating territorial gains, he was building an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the heart of Europe. With each passing week, thousands of Soviet tanks, cannons, and planes were strategically repositioned, creating a war machine that could in the near future become invincible. Churchill knew that the window of opportunity to contain this expansion was rapidly closing, and that decisive action was needed before it was too late. The decision to consider a preemptive military action against the Soviet Union was not taken lightly. Churchill had dedicated his political career to understanding and fighting totalitarian regimes, first warning of the Nazi danger when few listened, and now identifying an even greater threat in the form of communist expansionism. The Prime Minister understood that Stalin was not merely an inconvenient ally, but a fundamental ideological adversary whose objectives were incompatible with Western freedom and democracy. The Soviet Union did not just seek security or war reparations, it sought the revolutionary transformation of all Europe under the communist model. This was not a conflict that could be resolved through diplomacy or mutual concessions. It was an existential struggle between two irreconcilable visions of how humanity should be organized and governed. On May 22, 1945, Churchill called an extraordinary meeting of the British Chiefs of Staff Committee, instructing them to elaborate a detailed military plan for what would later be known as Operation Unthinkable. The objective was clear and ambitious: to impose the joint will of the United States and the British Empire upon the Soviet Union through military force, compelling Stalin to withdraw his troops from Eastern Europe and allow the establishment of truly democratic governments in the occupied territories. The operation was to be conceived as a surprise attack that would leverage Western air and naval superiority to offset the terrestrial numerical disadvantage. Churchill believed that a decisive demonstration of military force could convince Stalin to negotiate on terms favorable to the Western powers, thus avoiding a prolonged war that would further devastate an already exhausted Europe. It was an audacious plan that reflected both the strategic genius and the relentless determination of the British leader to preserve the democratic values for which he had fought throughout his political life. The military planning for Operation Unthinkable revealed the extraordinary magnitude of the challenge that Western planners faced when contemplating a conflict with the Soviet Union. British and American military analysts worked tirelessly during the following weeks to assess the relative capabilities of the opposing forces, creating a detailed picture that was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The Red Army, with its ranks swollen by 4 years of continuous combat against the best German divisions, had evolved into a highly efficient and disciplined war machine. Its troops were not just numerous, they were experienced veterans who had demonstrated exceptional capacity in large-scale offensive operations, from the Battle of Stalingrad to the capture of Berlin. Soviet commanders had perfected armored warfare and mass artillery tactics that surpassed even German innovations in many fundamental aspects. The Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming and mathematically challenging for any sensible military planner. Western intelligence estimated that Stalin could mobilize the equivalent of 140 Allied infantry divisions, in addition to 30 fully equipped armored divisions and 24 independent tank brigades. This terrestrial force represented a concentration of military power unprecedented in European history, surpassing even the armies that Napoleon had commanded during his most ambitious continental campaigns. In contrast, the Allied forces available for an immediate offensive totaled only 47 divisions, 14 armored, 25 infantry, 5 airborne, and 3 additional divisions of special classification yet to be determined. The math was brutally simple. The Soviets possessed a 2-to-1 numerical advantage in armor and more than 4-to-1 in infantry, numbers that transformed any direct terrestrial confrontation into an extremely risky proposition for Western forces. Western logistical limitations further complicated the strategic situation. 11 Allied divisions were permanently committed to the occupation and administration of territories such as Germany, Italy, and Austria, responsibilities that could not be abandoned without creating power vacuums that the Soviets themselves could exploit. 25 additional divisions would be needed to defend a front line stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic, a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers across varied and often challenging terrain. These defensive commitments meant that the forces available for offensive operations were even more limited than the initial numbers suggested. Planners also faced the additional problem of American demobilization, as Congress and public opinion in the United States intensely pressured for the quick return of American troops to their home soil, constantly reducing the contingent available for future European operations. Operation Unthinkable's initial strategy focused on a massive armored offensive in the region between Stettin, Schneidermühl, and Bydgoszcz, an area chosen for its topographic characteristics favorable to tank movement and its relative proximity to Western supply bases. The plan foresaw a coordinated surprise attack that would leverage Allied air superiority to neutralize Soviet communications and isolate Red Army units from the central chain of command. The hope was that a series of initial tactical victories would create sufficient psychological momentum to force Stalin to reconsider his position in Eastern Europe. Planners calculated that if they managed to stabilize a defensive line from Danzig to Breslau during the autumn of 1945, this demonstration of force might be enough to convince the Soviet leader to negotiate on terms more favorable to Western interests, thus avoiding the need for a prolonged total war. The air dimension of the projected conflict offered some of the few clear advantages for Western forces. The British Royal Air Force and the American Army Air Force combined a total of 6,514 tactical and fighter aircraft, complemented by 2,464 heavy bombers capable of strategic operations in depth. This air fleet would face approximately 9,180 Soviet fighters and ground attack aircraft, plus 2,280 light bombers, 1,000 strategic bombers, and 1,100 naval aircraft. Although the Soviet numbers were impressive, Western analysts identified critical vulnerabilities in Soviet air capability that could be exploited in a prolonged campaign. The Red Air Force depended on the West for almost half of its aviation fuel, a dependency that would become fatal in a war against the suppliers themselves. Additionally, a significant proportion of Soviet aircraft construction materials, including rubber and aluminum, originated from Western sources that would be immediately cut off in case of hostilities. Western technological superiority in radar systems and strategic bombing capabilities represented a significant qualitative advantage that could partially offset the numerical disadvantage. American heavy bombers, particularly the B-29 Superfortress, operated at altitudes that were beyond the effective capacity of existing Soviet interceptors. This capability would allow precise attacks against Soviet industrial infrastructure without significant risk of interception, potentially paralyzing Soviet war production capacity within weeks. The British Royal Navy maintained absolute control of the seas, enabling amphibious operations along the Baltic coast and ensuring secure supply lines across the Atlantic. British and American aircraft carriers could operate with impunity in the Baltic Sea, providing close air support for terrestrial operations and attacking strategic targets in the Soviet rear. This combination of strategic air power and naval supremacy offered Western planners tools that Stalin simply did not possess in his military arsenal. The geopolitical ramifications of a conflict between the former Allies extended far beyond purely military considerations, creating a strategic puzzle of extraordinary complexity. Stalin would not be a passive adversary. Western planners had to anticipate Soviet checkmate moves that could transform a regionalized European conflict into a truly global conflagration. The geographical position of the Soviet Union offered multiple avenues for retaliation that could force the Allies to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, further diluting their already limited advantages. A Soviet invasion of Scandinavia would cut off Arctic supply routes and directly threaten Great Britain, while operations in the Balkans could completely destabilize the Eastern Mediterranean and compromise British communication lines with India and other colonial possessions. The most immediate and strategically significant danger resided in the Soviet potential for operations in the Middle East, particularly against the oil fields of Iran and Iraq, which were vital for the Western war effort. Stalin had already demonstrated interest in this region during post-war negotiations, and a successful Soviet campaign to capture these critical energy resources could fundamentally alter the global balance of power. Without guaranteed access to Middle Eastern oil, Western logistical capabilities would be severely compromised, making sustained military operations practically impossible. Additionally, Soviet control of these resources would deny the Allies the revenue needed to finance a prolonged war, while simultaneously enormously strengthening Stalin's economic position. Planners recognized that effectively defending against these multiple threats would require a level of military mobilization that significantly exceeded the resources immediately available to the Western democracies. The question of public opinion represented perhaps the most insurmountable obstacle to the successful implementation of Operation Unthinkable. After 6 devastating years of World War, the British and American populations were physically and emotionally exhausted, eager for a return to peacetime normality, and deeply skeptical about additional military adventures. Allied propaganda had consistently portrayed the Soviet Union as a valuable partner in the fight against fascism, making it extremely difficult to publicly justify a surprise attack against Stalin just weeks after the joint victory over Nazi Germany. Churchill understood that any conflict with the Soviets would require total national mobilization, including renewed rationing, maximum-scale war production, and potentially the return of compulsory military conscription. These measures would be politically impossible without massive public support, which simply did not exist for a preventive war against a former ally. The democracy that Churchill had fought to preserve now limited his ability to act decisively against what he perceived as an existential threat to democratic values. The logistical dimensions of a military campaign against the Soviet Union proved to be even more challenging when examined in detail. During World War II, the Soviets had systematically relocated their defense industries beyond the Ural Mountains, placing them thousands of kilometers away from any possible Western attack. This industrial redistribution meant that even a successful Western campaign that captured Moscow and Leningrad would not necessarily paralyze the Soviet capacity to continue the war. The Red Army could replicate the strategy it had used so effectively against Napoleon and Hitler: strategic retreat into the Russian interior, followed by a prolonged war of attrition that would exploit the immense Soviet distances and natural resources. Russian roads, notoriously poor even in the best of times, would make the movement of Western supplies extremely difficult, while the Russian winter promised the same logistical horrors that had destroyed previous invading armies. The gradual realization of these complexities discouraged any initial enthusiasm for Operation Unthinkable among professional military planners. Although Churchill maintained his conviction about the need to contain Soviet expansion, it became progressively clear that a direct military confrontation in 1945 would be not only risky, but potentially suicidal for the Western democracies. The timing was also against the Allies. Each passing day strengthened the Soviet position, while weakening the Western capacity for effective military response. American demobilization accelerated inexorably, removing from Europe precisely those forces that would be essential for any operation against Stalin. Simultaneously, the morale and combat readiness of the remaining Allied troops decreased as individual soldiers focused on the prospect of returning home instead of preparing for a new conflict. It was a strategic equation that decisively favored Stalin, who maintained absolute control over his forces and could mobilize Soviet resources without regard for public opinion or democratic pressures. In June 1945, approximately 1 month after the initial authorization of Operation Unthinkable, Churchill was forced to confront the brutal reality that his audacious plan was impracticable under existing circumstances. The military reports were unanimous in their pessimistic conclusions. Although a Western victory was not technically impossible, the cost would be so extraordinary that it would destroy precisely those free societies that the operation intended to protect. A total war against the Soviet Union would require military mobilization on a scale even greater than during World War II, transforming Western democracies into militarized states that might lose their own democratic characteristics in the process of defeating communism. This irony was not lost on Churchill, who had dedicated his career to preserving liberal values against totalitarian regimes. Operation Unthinkable was formally cancelled, but the lessons learned during its planning would fundamentally shape Western strategy during the following decades of the Cold War. Churchill had correctly understood that Stalin represented an existential threat to Western freedom, but he also recognized that this threat should be fought through patient containment rather than direct military confrontation. The world had narrowly avoided a Third World War in 1945, but the tensions identified by Churchill would guarantee decades of global rivalry between the emerging superpowers, defining the fundamental structure of international politics until the end of the 20th century.